You're live.
Okay, so we're going to try this again. We had some technical difficulties. I'm having technical difficulties with our technology, therefore it was technical difficulties. Anyways, we're back. Hopefully we will stay streaming this time. So for those of you that couldn't make out our garbled transmissions, this is Curtis Schmidt. He is our Zoological Collections Manager. I am Andrew Bethan, the Education and Outreach Director here at the Sternberg. And we're going to talk about bats that are not flying rats.
That's right. So thank you, Ian. I want to welcome you all. If you were here last week, we were upstairs in the rattlesnake exhibit, and we talked a little bit about the rattlesnakes and showed you a little bit of the behind the scenes. We are now in one of the scientific research collections rooms known as the Flea Hardy Range. So this is where my primary job takes place. If you remember, as we were talking last week up in the snakes, I like to delve out beyond herpetology, and obviously I'm the Zoological Collections Manager. I manage 6 different collections of zoology, but I really like bats as well. People think I'm strange because I like to study things most people hate, whether it's frogs or snakes or bats, things like that. I don't know why. They just fascinate me. I don't do it because they're weird and they're scary and most people don't like them. They just fascinate me, and bats really fascinate me. They're amazing. We're going to start by looking at the anatomy of a bat, and bear with me here. I hope you guys can see this. So basically, if you look at the skeleton of a bat, it's got all the same stuff that we've got. Basically, if you look at those wings, they're very long fingers. They have all the same digits that we do. They have a tail that we don't have, but many of you will probably realize and remember that actually we do have a tail during our embryonic development, and it goes away eventually. So if you look at that skeleton, it basically looks like a very tiny person. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. So that's the skeleton of a bat. So to show you in just a little more detail the anatomy of a bat and some of the specializations. Bats are mammals. They are not birds. A lot of people think because they have powered flight, they are birds or they're related to birds. That could not be further from the truth. Birds are actually more closely related to snakes than they are to bats. So being mammals, they've got fur, they've got mammary glands, so they feed their young milk. They've got a 4-chambered heart, and any of the other things that make a mammal.
Glands.
So, glands, things like that. So, important to remember that these are not birds. They are not related to birds. Bats are very fascinating because they are the only mammals that are capable of true powered flight. So there's lots of different mammals out there that are known to quote unquote fly, but they're mostly gliders. So I'm thinking things like sugar gliders and flying squirrels, things like that. They glide, they don't actually have powered flight. So although they're not closely related to birds, they do share some similar features because they do fly. The first of which has to do with the skeleton, which I've showed you already. They have very, very light and hollow bones. So they break very, very easily. So similar to birds who have what we call pneumatic bones that allows them to be able to fly and be very, very light for their powered flight. So going back into the anatomy of a bat. So I showed you the fingers and the bones. If you look at the wings, that's what comprises the wings is the different fingers. These little guys right here are actually the thumbs. And if you ever see a bat crawling around on the ground or crawling up a tree, crawling to their roost, they're using their thumbs to crawl. So they don't have to fly all the time. They can bounce, they can hop, they can crawl. They primarily fold up their wings and those other fingers and use those thumbs to crawl and climb. some other interesting things. So the skin that makes up the membranes of the wing are called the protopatagium, which is the wing membrane, and the uropatagium, which is the tail membrane. So that's what helps them fly. They use their tail, kind of like a rudder, to kind of help steer them as they're flying and make them stop quickly and change directions quickly, things like that. But the main use of that uropatagium is actually to catch their prey, which is very interesting. And before I talk more about that, their primary feeding mechanism, and because they are nocturnal, these things come out and feed at night. All of their activity is at night for the most part. They use echolocation and a very elaborate ear system to basically create sound using their mouth. Basically, it's like sonar. They're clicking. Most of the time, we humans can't hear it. We can't pick it up. It's inaudible. Some of them are audible, but most of them are not. So they're sending out constant clicks that are then bouncing off objects that are in the sky and in the air and coming back to be received by their ears again. So they also have inside their ears a little fleshy appendage called a tragus, and that's what this is in humans, this little fleshy protuberance right here. That is our tragus. That is a remnant of basically the same thing that these bats are using it for. So they use their ears and they use their tragus to figure out what exactly direction that the animal is at this, in this example, their prey, their food, how far away it is, what distance it is, and how it's moving. So a very, very elaborate system. And when they're feeding, they're constantly producing these echolocation bands. It's really, really interesting.
We got a couple questions for you.
Already questions. Excellent. Bring them.
That looks like a pretty hoary bat.
This is a hoary bat.
It is.
That's mean. Why would you say that?
So this is a hoary bat, and the word hoary, although it sounds bad, actually means frosted. So that's what this thing looks like. It looks like it's a frosted bat. This is actually one of our biggest species of bats that we have here in Kansas. In Kansas, we have 16 species of bats that have been known to occur in the state.
Wait, how many?
16.
That was the question. How many bats are in Kansas?
16 bats in Kansas, but they're not always in Kansas. Some of them just barely come to the periphery of the state and have been found within the state boundaries once or twice is all. But 16 have been known to occur in the state.
So how many times does a species of bat need to be seen or collected or observed before you say, wow, this is a native species?
Oh boy, that's a tough question and a good one, and I'm not sure I could definitely answer that other than personally, bats can fly, so I would say if they're found in the state once, they naturally occur here.
Well, I could hit you with this too. Curtis, what is a species?
Oh my, we're not even going to go into that one.
It was a nerd joke.
That's a question for about 4 hours later.
Well, Elmer Fink is watching. You could ask him.
Hi, Dr. Fink. Thank you for tuning in.
Yes, hello.
How are bats helpful? Question number 2.
Bats are extremely helpful for a number of reasons. All of the species, the 16 species that we have here in the state of Kansas, are insectivores, meaning they eat insects. And these things have the metabolism like you wouldn't believe. So basically, when these things are awake and they're active, they're constantly eating food. And again, they're flying and they're flying at night. They're echolocating for their food. So they're mostly eating things that are flying around, flying insects. So to make a real long story short, they're extremely beneficial because they eat tons and tons, and I mean literally tons, because there's millions of bats out there every night, of pest insects. And when I'm talking pest insects, I'm usually talking about agricultural pests. So things that make a direct impact on our income and the commerce of the state of Kansas.
So I'm wondering, how do bats catch the insects? Like, do they just grab them in their mouths, or is there some feature that they use to catch them?
That's a good question, and I was actually going to talk about that, but I forgot. So their uropatagium right here is basically like a big net. So they're echolocating. They come up. They're making these buzzes that are bouncing off this insect. They get close enough, they reach down and scoop it up with their uropatagium and hold it there until they can then swallow the bug and chew it up. So that is one of the very primary importances of having that uropatagium and the long tail as well, is to make a scoop so that they can catch it out of midair and continue flying until they can go eat it. Sometimes they'll eat it while they're still flying, if it's small enough. Sometimes it's big enough they'll need to go to a roost, stop what they're doing, eat, and then go out and hunt some more. Great question.
Thank you.
So there's lots of ways that we study these things, but they are very difficult to study because they are nocturnal and they come out at night, but also because they fly. So studying their roost habitats and things like that is not the simplest thing in the world. The cool thing is we can actually band bats. So if you look at the little metal band right here, it's got a number on it. So I put the band on there. It doesn't hurt the animal at all. It slides freely up and down, and it's got a number on it so we can know exactly which individual this is. Very interesting. And the reason why we do that is because, you know, scientists study the same places many, many years. It's one of the things that I've done. And we've just recently learned that bats can live up to 30 years.
Wow.
Which seems like an awful
That's
lot
crazy.
for a small flying mammal, because most small mammals don't live very long. Mice, rats, things like that, they don't live very long at all. But we are starting to get recaptures of banded bats that go all the way back to the 70s and 80s.
Wow.
So that's very, very fascinating.
Any ideas on why they have such a long lifespan?
There's few things out there that kill them. They have very few predators. There's diseases out there that kill them. There's parasites out there that kill them. And they're lucky, obviously, to live that long. Most of them, you know, probably only live half that. But very few predators. That's why they're nocturnal primarily. Is because one, their food comes out at night, but two, because they can avoid most predators like hawks and snakes and things like that. Although there are things that get them while they're roosting during the day, if they're roosting in trees and caves and things like that. So, enough about that. So these are the bats, some of the bats that we have in the state of Kansas. You can see some of the diversity there. So we've got ones that range in size from the hoary bat, which I just had, which is one of our bigger ones, to some of the tiny Myotis species and the tricolored bats, which are down here.
I'm fond of the big brown bat.
And it's funny you say that, because if you are familiar with bats at all and you live in any of the cities around here or in the state of Kansas, I would say 90 out of 100 bats that you ever run into are the big brown bat. These are the ones that live in people's attics, they live in churches, they live in buildings. They basically have come to rely on human habitation for their roosting, their hibernating, and things like that. Which brings up another point. Some of the bats that you're seeing right now hibernate during the winter because their food source is gone. And just like birds, there's also ones that migrate to basically follow the activity of the insects they're prey.
We got two more questions. Can bats harm humans?
Typically not. They do carry rabies, but less than 1% of them actually have rabies. And also, even if they do have rabies, the odds of them coming into contact with the human are very, very slim. There's lots of doom and gloom and panic out there. And people say if you ever find a bat in your house, you should go get tested for rabies and treated for rabies. That's nonsense. Simply because, as I mentioned, lots of big brown bats are occurring in people's attics. Occasionally they'll make their way into their homes. The odds of them actually having rabies and transmitting them to you, astronomically low. And getting treated for rabies and getting a rabies vaccine is not cheap. We're talking about $3,000 probably for full treatment for rabies.
It's probably not a lot of fun to go through.
Not a lot of fun. I mean, if you don't mind shots, they're just like any other shot. But one cool thing I want to show you as well is because we in museums don't always just keep adults, right? we have a good series of individuals. And one thing that I want to show you here is an embryo of a bat. And hopefully we get a good video of this. But if you see that tiny little embryo, and usually when they reproduce, they usually have 1 to 2 young. Sometimes they will have up to 5, which is absolutely bizarre, because the females can only take care of 4 at a time. But if you look at it, you can see the embryos, everything is forming within that bat. So it's already got the protopatagium, the uropatagium, the tail. It's already got all the fingers, all that stuff. So very interesting. So again, scientists use a wide variety of things, these things, from juveniles to adults and even embryos, to study a very wide variety of things. So I also pulled out some of our other specimens from our collections that are not found in Kansas, and I'm going to go through those relatively quickly. I pulled out some of my favorites. So this is called Allen's big-eared bat. It's my favorite for 2 reasons. One, it's got those giant satellite-looking ears, again, which helps it in its echolocation. Very good at echolocating. But also because this species in general is extremely mellow and very, very calm. I've actually only caught one of these in my life in the desert southwest in New Mexico. And they're so gentle and so calm, you don't even need to use gloves. They don't try to bite you at all. They just basically hang out and check out their surroundings until they're released. Very gentle bat with very big ears, very unique. Another one of my favorites from the desert southwest is called the Mexican long-tongued bat. So this one's very interesting for a number of reasons, primarily because this one does not eat insects, as far as we know. Probably does occasionally, but these guys eat pollen. They're known as, how do you say that word? Pollanivores. Is that right? They eat pollen, basically.
So pollen, but not the nectar?
They eat pollen and nectar, okay. Yes, both. But these guys are the ones that are primarily responsible for pollinating agaves, which, if you know much about the tequila industry, it relies very, very important. These are very important for the tequila industry.
I'm resisting the urge to break into song right now. It's very difficult.
So very important little guys right here. They're very important for pollinating a number of agave species and plants down in the desert southwest. And if you'll notice, look at that uropatagium. Very, very short tail and very small uropatagium. Why is that, you might ask? And as we're moving forward, you're going to notice several of the species we're going to look at have the same thing. Little to no tail and a very small uropatagium. Because again, they don't use that to catch insects from midair. So they don't need it.
Do you have lots of pollinivores?
There's only a handful, actually, called pollanivores, or however the heck you say that. Words are hard. So a couple of them come into the desert southwest to help pollinate our agaves and things like that. So here's another one. Everybody's probably familiar with this guy. This is known as a vampire bat. So these are not in the United States yet. They're in Mexico, and then south, down all the way into South America. A couple things I want to point out with these guys is, again, no tail, no uropatagium. So do they eat insects? No. Another thing that I want to point out is look how long those thumbs are. If you've ever seen a video of these guys and how they feed and what they do, is basically they jump on the ground and they run up or hop up to livestock. Things like that, pigs, cattle, other wild animals like that. So they've got those really long thumbs to help them hop and help them crawl along the ground, as well as climb up onto the back of these animals. So they're called vampire bats because they're sanguinivores, which means they eat blood. That's all they eat. So they have really, really super sharp incisors, which are the front teeth. So they will climb up onto a sleeping cow or pig or whatever it may be in the middle of the night. They're very lightweight, so they won't get noticed. And their teeth are so sharp, they will cut a slit in the animal, which then begins to bleed. Their saliva actually has anticoagulant in it, so it will continuously bleed. So after they make that tiny cut that they can't even feel because their teeth are so sharp, the blood continues to come out, and they sit there and they lap up the blood. So very interesting animals, but as I mentioned, not in the US, but getting very, very close. And with climate change, I imagine they're going to be here before too long.
We have a question from Florence, who is 6 years old, from Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Awesome.
How high can bats fly?
Gosh, I don't know.
You don't know.
Because I don't fly that high. They fly as high as I can see. I imagine a couple 100 feet.
I say as high as the bugs go, probably.
As high as the insects fly, which I don't know how high that is. And also, I imagine when they're migrating, they can migrate pretty darn high. But that's a tough question, and you stump the biologist. I really don't know how high they fly. Maybe with advancing technology, we'll be able to get that pretty soon. Put a transmitter on it and see the elevation, see how high they are when they're flying. But great question, Florence. So this guy right here is another fruit-eating bat. This is a Jamaican fruit-eating bat. So this one does actually come into the U.S. in very southern Florida. And you'll see, again, no tail, no uropatagium, so it's not eating insects, it's eating fruits. So a good-sized bat, mostly of the tropics, the neotropics.
Given all these bats with no tails, Jason, H7, wants to know if all the bats in Kansas have tails.
Yes, they do, Jason, because they all catch insects. So, yes, all of them do. We don't have any fruit-eating bats. So, good question. This here is one of my favorite neotropical bats. You've probably seen videos of this on the Discovery Channel or something like that. This is called a fisherman bat. And again, if you notice, very, very short tail, but this one has a huge uropatagium and very long legs and very long toes. Why? I imagine you guys can figure that out with its name, fisherman bat. It uses its echolocation for something completely different. So instead of getting insects out of the air, it uses its echolocation to get ripples in the water, saying that there's a fish at the surface of the water. So then they swoop down, they use that giant scoop right there of their uropatagium and their giant feet to scoop up the fish and then eat it. That's their primary food source, is fish. So very, very cool bats. I really, really like these guys.
Malachi agrees. He says those are cool.
Very, very cool bats. Thanks, Malachi. And last, but certainly not least, we have a representative of a suborder of bats called Megachiroptera. So bats are in an order of their own within mammals. It's actually the second most diverse group of mammals, second only to rodents. And that Chiroptera is broken up into two main groups. We've got the Megachiropterans, which are the big bats, basically, the giant fruit-eating bats. And then all the others are in the Microchiroptera, basically meaning small bats. So here's a good example of a flying fox. You've probably seen these at zoos, but if you look carefully and closely, you can see all the same features in this guy that you could see in the others. Except, for the most part, they don't do any echolocating. They use their nice, well-developed nose to sniff out fruit. So they'll go hang out in trees. These are mostly from Asia, some in Africa, and then Australia has mostly Megachiropterans. So with no further ado, if there's no other questions...
Oh, we got two questions.
All right.
Questions.
Questions. Fire away.
Here's the first one for you.
This is not a bat, Reese. No.
Question is, do bats' echolocation work the same way as dolphins' echolocation?
I would say yes, it does. Almost exactly the same way. It's basically sonar. This being a mammal as well, which a lot of people don't realize, this is a dolphin skull. But yes, porpoises, dolphins, whales also use sonar to echolocate prey underneath the water and to communicate with one another as well, which bats also do. They also use their echolocating and their chirps to communicate to one another as well. I have no idea what they're saying or what they're communicating, but very, very similar. So thanks, Reese, for asking that question.
That was Brenna. Our last question here is, how do you catch bats to study them?
Oh, that's a great question. Catching bats is a lot of fun. So in order to answer that question, I'm going to quickly go through the day in the life of a bat for you. We know that bats are sleeping during the day and come out at night, right? So when they wake up, as the sun's starting to set, the moon's starting to come up, the first thing they want to do is get a drink of water. Because as I mentioned, their metabolism is so fast. When they're awake, they constantly need to be eating. So even when they're sleeping, their metabolism is working overdrive. So they're respiring a lot, losing lots of water. So when we breathe, we lose water droplets, right? So they're doing the same thing. So when they wake up, they're really, really thirsty. So they need to go find a source of water. So that works out beneficial for us because we know that. We know that's what they're going to do. So the easiest thing for us to do to catch bats is to go put up a giant mist net, which is the same thing that ornithologists use to catch birds, because it's a very, very fine mesh net that you can't really see very well. And as long as they're not echolocating, which they're typically not at this time, because they're not looking for food. They're using their memory and their vision to go find water before they go out and forage for food. So we put a giant net over the water, they fly down to get a drink, they get stuck in the net, there we've got them. Then we can put bands on them, we can put transmitters on them, we can do a variety of things to study the different things about them. Plus they hang out, and they're going to digest their food while they take a nap. So they're digesting very rapidly, they're pooping a whole lot. Then they're going to go out and they're going to do it again. So they go out, feed themselves to where they almost explode again. Then they'll go back to their day roost. So there's two different roosts. And this is a question I get a lot from people that live in towns. They'll wake up every single morning and have droppings on their porch and can't figure out what they're from. Because they don't see mice, there's never mice there. They sweep their porch every single morning because there's droppings in the same spot every single morning. That's because those bats are using that as a night roost. So they're hanging out, digesting their food, pooping a bunch, because anything with a really high metabolism has to poop a lot. And then they're moving on to do it again. So, great question.
We'll wrap up with two questions. Ashley's got two questions, and we'll maybe wrap up with these. The first one is, do bats mate for life? And the second one is, can a person tour this area of the museum?
Oh, those are great questions. Bats do not mate for life. They are very opportunistic. They will basically mate with whatever female or male they come in contact with during mating season, which is in the fall. This is very interesting as well. Most bats actually breed and mate in the fall before they go into hibernation. So they store the sperm while they're hibernating until they emerge in the spring, they can start feeding, then they will actually impregnate themselves with that sperm that is still in their body and still viable, and then they become pregnant. That way they have the full season of prey availability, food availability for the young to be raised, nursed, and go out on their own. Second part of that question was, can people tour this area? Absolutely. However, it does cost a little extra to tour this area. This is something we're relatively new to trying out. And we need to know well in advance, so at least a couple days in advance, so we can be prepared to give tours back.
Otherwise, you might end up like with a tour guide like me, when I'm just like, there's some cabinets and some animals.
Which would be fine for a lot of people, because cabinets with animals are fascinating.
I'm not that bad.
So again, thank you guys for joining us. I will see you quite a bit this week. We'll see Ian twice a day.
I'm always here. I have a cot in my office. So yeah, be sure to share our live feeds when they're no longer live. We really appreciate that. Give us likes. Keep sending us comments and questions. And we will see you tomorrow.
Over and out.